Hey there, I'm Stan Baker, one of your hosts for Circle Forum, along with Shelley and Steve. And this week, we're talking about how white settler bias creeps into simple things like the questions that we ask. In our work with student absenteeism, we often get the question, how do we get these Indigenous students into our schools? And what I find fascinating is that although many think that colonialism is something of the past, the question itself illustrates that colonialism is alive and unfortunately well in our education system right now. I think it's important to talk about because if we want to build connections with Indigenous families and students, we need to talk about the language that we're using and how it reflects a settler bias. And I mean, really, with the history of residential schools in Canada, is it any wonder that there are some suspicions about education systems in Canada? So if you've ever struggled with how to approach or listen to Indigenous students and families, this podcast is for you. Here's what's coming. First of all, you're going to fail at some of the things that you do, and you're going to make mistakes, and it's an opportunity to learn from your mistakes. If you use trigger warnings, that can prepare people who are in meetings or conversations for what's coming next. And thirdly, ease into the meeting. Focus on the connections with the people who are involved in the meeting before you get to the issue or the reason for the meeting. At the end of the episode, be sure to visit our website, www.restorative.ca or www.circleforum.ca. Follow us on YouTube, Circle Forum, or just send me an email to stan@restorative.ca. Now let's join the conversation with Shelley, Steve, and me, Stan. So in some of our trainings, we've come across questions that people have asked. I'm just going to read one of the questions that we asked because I think it gets at a number of things that we need to talk about in this podcast this week. And the question is this: how do you get some parents or grandparents on board as to the importance of school who are traumatized by residential school?
So my first response, before even thinking about how to answer that question, is the question itself. The question itself is very biased. It's already setting a tone of what we think should be happening rather than looking at our role in this.
The question itself is where you've got some problems because
I'm already stumbling because of the question itself.
It's basically saying we're here and we want to get you here.
Yes.
So what do you need to do, or what do we need to do to you in order to get you here? And by the way, there's residential schools too. Holy smokes.
And we believe our way
is better.
We believe our way is better, that there's an importance to you being in this building, and what do we need to do to get you here? Because we know better. That's what that says.
And I go even deeper with that when we start to parse that whole question as to the wording. And when we say the importance of school, and I think if you talk to a lot of people, they would talk about, and Indigenous people would talk about the importance of education, but not necessarily school. When we think of school, we think of four walls and a roof, a brick building, something, and that's the residential schools that caused the trauma. So I would think they would think, yeah, education is important, but that doesn't necessarily mean going to a school. So I think we really need to start thinking about, to your point, Shelley, what is that question truly asking, and what's it implying? It's implying that the colonial school system is where they need to be. And that means a brick and mortar building that we run, and why we need to somehow get across them that this is important for them. And you know what? I bet you for a lot of them, it's not that important. Education is, but not being in our schools is.
It just shows you how deep the colonial mindset is, in that it actually is, that colonial mindset is actually part of this question.
Exactly. Right? Yeah. I mean, it probably came from a supportive, caring mind or a person, but the whole, how do I get them on board with the language there to the way I do things, or that we do things, already has, I as a settler know better, and you need to get on board with what's happening here.
The person who probably asked this question, and to your point, Shelley, is probably very well meaning, but they've got some concerns about attendance in their school and getting kids to school, because there's pressure from whatever level above that we have to get kids to school. And so what can we do to get these kids to school? And it really ignores the entire picture of education for our Indigenous students. It's a very pragmatic question. We need to get our kids in the classrooms. We need to get the attendance numbers better. What can we do? And a lot of the problems is that a lot of these Indigenous kids are coming from families who are traumatized by residential schools. So we have to get around that and get them back in these buildings, when really we should be meeting them on their ground. And that's the real challenge, because maybe that's probably not the mandate of the school board that this in the school that this person is in.
So let's just talk about the trauma for a minute. How do you approach people who have experienced trauma? And then let's talk about trauma from residential schools. But first, trauma.
Certainly you need to be trauma informed. You have to understand how people react to those traumas. And then how do we approach having those conversations with either students or parents or grandparents about the trauma and the effect it's had. And
so part of being trauma informed is that no one's trauma response or reaction is going to be the same. And it could be the same event interpreted by different people and integrated in different ways. So that's the first piece for me, is just to know that there won't be a nice pat answer, that this is what it's going to look like. So that's where the being curious and being authentic and trying to understand. Of course, we will never understand unless you've experienced something similar or had someone close to you something similar, but to assume that you're never going to truly understand the trauma, but that you're open to learning about it and to understanding what we could do to support you in whatever it is through your lens of what you've experienced.
And part of what happens with being trauma informed is that it changes your questions, right? Instead of asking, what's wrong with you? What's wrong with your family? What's wrong with your family history? The question becomes, what's happened to you? And so now we're right into restorative practice, right? Trauma-informed restorative practice with the kinds of questions. So what's happened to you that has led to this situation? And I think the other thing in terms of trauma is that it takes a lot of skill. And it's not going to be something that one person in a school is going to be able to address. It's going to take a lot of teamwork, and candidly, with that curiosity and some of that risk, we're going to make mistakes. As white educators in schools that have a high percentage of Indigenous kids or kids of color, we're going to make some mistakes, and we have to be ready to learn from those mistakes. That with our kids all the time, learn from your mistakes. But as adults, we're so afraid to make a mistake.
I think in that carrying with that line about making mistakes, it's starting to think about the trauma there. And Shelley and I have talked about this with our circles and circle starter questions and circle topics. We need to really think carefully of the questions we ask or the topics we talk about, because things that we did 10 years ago, we probably won't talk about. We always talked about, what's your favorite vacation? Now, we know some kids probably can't afford a vacation. And where does that put them in relation to the kids who are at Disney World 5 times a year? And so we start to really think about that. And so talk to your colleagues and talk to your friends and say, what do you think of this question I want to talk about in my circle today? One of the things that I've noticed lately coming out, and you see it more and more now, and whether it's in a newspaper article or at the beginning of a news story online or whatever, is it's called a trigger warning. And they put these trigger warnings because I think we've become aware that a lot of the things that reporters report about or the story talks about, or even the questions we ask, may trigger some type of previous experience or trauma. And so we put trigger warnings. And I started thinking about it in terms of the restorative questions we ask at school or the conversations, giving some warnings. Tomorrow we are going to talk about such and such, almost like a trigger warning. If you find this uncomfortable, come and see me. So we can start to give people a chance to come and say, that topic is going to make me feel uncomfortable. So then you as an educator say, maybe either I won't do it, or we'll do it in a different way, or what will make you comfortable, or should we just, can you be excused? There's a lot of different things that can happen. So I think knowing that a lot of people have suffered, as Shelley said, trauma to different degrees, even over the same incident, we have to give those warnings or advance notice of some of the things we're going to talk about.
And as somebody who is supporting people who have experienced trauma, and you may not know that they experienced trauma, and many of the kids that are really struggling, you may never know what they've experienced, but there's something happening for them. So we just operate from that place, is to be vulnerable and to be open, and that you don't have the answers, and that some might not work the way that you had planned it to work, that you may need to change things. And that's setting the culture with the restorative mindset, the culture of that I'm open to learning and that I am curious, and that please correct me if that's not right, or let's do this a different way. So that people will approach you if they're feeling that from you, if you've already established that kind of culture in your school, your classroom, your office, wherever that is.
Okay, now what about trauma by residential schools? Because that was part of this question, right?
That may be thinking of a school board or from a larger people at the top of that hierarchy. That may be a question they might want to think about in terms of working with their partners, their Indigenous partners in the community. For teachers and school people working in schools, school employees to try and address that at their level may be difficult. When you've got a large Indigenous population in your school catchment area, and you suspect that a large number of them have been traumatized by the residential school system, that may be a conversation to have at that top level with directors and superintendents or very specific people with the Native partners to say, what can we do about this? Is it, if education, if you feel education is important, but our system is not for you, what can we do? And what would you like to see? And so we've talked about it a few times about the school board in the North that is Indigenous run, and they're creating their own structures and their own programs. To me, that's very forward thinking on the part of whoever to say, okay, we're going to give you the power to organize your education in the way that you see most fit. And that's going to take some time and many years, but probably 5 or 10 years from now, it's going to look nothing like the colonial structure that we've got right now, because they're going to create what works for them, because education is still important for them. But the school, our structure isn't important. So I think each of our school boards, it's almost imperative that they have those conversations. If our school structure isn't working for you, what can we do? Because educating your children and your youth is important.
I love that. That's
Yeah,
a great
yeah.
question. That's a great question. And the thing that strikes me too is I think we have this sense, certainly as a white educator, I have this sense, let me speak for myself, that, okay, it's some people, right? And what I need to move my thinking to is that it's all Indigenous folks have been impacted by this. Like
Yes.
every Indigenous person has either experienced it, has someone in their family who's experienced it. Then I think it's really important, even just at the classroom level, to bring somebody in to tell a story. The parallel that I can only make with my teaching was about the Holocaust in World War II with the Nazis and their persecution and execution of so many Jews. To bring somebody in to tell the story, I was there, here's what happened to me, here's how many of my family were lost. Telling that story was very powerful to help move people's thinking and understanding of what went on. And I think similarly, to put ourselves as professionals, one of the people that we talked to, one of the educators we talked to in the last couple of years on our podcast, said that his perspective changed when he spent time listening to the stories of people who'd been impacted by residential schools, and that was a life changer for him.
Absolutely.
And that changed how he did things. And I think we have to do that for ourselves as adults, and then we have to find a way to, age appropriately, of course, make that possible for our students.
And that's the big part of being trauma informed, is to hear those first person stories, because we haven't experienced it. We have no idea. So you need to hear those stories. And that really was some of my most powerful learning as well, is having the opportunity to be part of those trainings, those experiences. And I don't know that all school staff get to have that.
So what kinds of suggestions would we make for people who are in positions of leadership superintendents, principals, teachers, staff members? What kinds of practical suggestions can we make about a question like that gets to an answer? That question again, how do you get some parents and grandparents on board as to the importance of school who are traumatized by residential schools?
They start by having a good look at your question, because that's what started
Mhm.
this conversation. And again, nobody's probably done that with any intent. And it doesn't matter what your position is. It doesn't hurt us to look at a question that we've posed. And are we being biased? Are we carrying some things into that question? And then that can spark a conversation, as it does, but also providing people with the opportunity to hear firsthand of others' experiences and how we can support that rather than thinking we need to bring them on board with the way we're doing things.
This is a conversation that has to happen with that superintendent or that director from the top, but the work also has to happen at the bottom. I've always said it's a top-down, bottom-up approach. The teachers, the indigenous support workers in that school, any support from that school can have those conversations, but enter the conversation with the idea that you want to find out how we can help, not here are the things that we can do for you. And you just got to openly ask the question. Your child's not attending. What can we do to help? And maybe the response you get is they're not going to come back to school, but I still want them to be educated. Now, what can you do to help me?
And I think even just refining that question, just getting on the idea of questions to ask, what do you need? What do you need? What do you as a grandparent need? What do you as a parent or what do you as a student need right now? And then listen.
I was a principal at a native school. I had responsibilities for that as part of my role. And we would go over periodically for meetings with the education council at the Native Reserve. And this was a time when a new superintendent of mine came on board and he wanted to accompany me because as me being in charge of the school, he was in charge of me, I suppose, and he wanted to come with. And so we went over to this meeting and I can't remember the starting time. Maybe it was 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And we got into the room and it was a couple minutes to 2 and we were the first ones there. And then a couple people would trickle in. And by about 5 or 10 after, he was looking at his watch saying, where is everybody? Why aren't we starting on time? And as people came in from the committee, the education committee, they would talk about the weather and they would talk about so-and-so's car and the lake and when's fishing going to finish and all these just relationship type casual conversations that neighbors would have. And he kept looking at his watch, wondering, when are we going to get this started? We need to get this meeting started. And I said, look, if we get down to business by 2:30, that'll be a good start. But I said, this is the way they do it. They need to socialize. That's the way they've done it in every meeting I've ever been at. They build their relationships. I always said, we ease into the purpose of the meeting. We don't start with the purpose of the meeting. This was not the way he wanted to do business. He wanted it to start on time. He said, I got to get back. I haven't got time for this. It was just not his way of doing business. And it was really bothersome to him. I'll give him credit. He didn't let it show to the people that were there with, but afterwards, as we were driving back and I was carpooling with him, I got an earful about this is not the way we need to do business with these people. Unfortunately, if we're going to be in charge of this school, then we need to get things running better. And I remember saying, if we are going to be in charge of the school, and I said, but we're not in charge of this school. We just have a role to play with them. They're paying for our services, but it's their school and their education committee. But it always struck me at that time because he was coming from a position of authority, of authoritarian, rigid structure. Let's move forward. Because his time was as a superintendent. Granted, you're pulled in 15 different ways, and you got 15 minutes for this and 20 minutes for that, and you got to move on. This didn't fit in with his structure, his timetable. If it was supposed to be a 1 hour meeting and it was taking 2 hours, that couldn't happen. And so it was up to me to make sure I went back and talked to them and say, we can't do it this way anymore, which I never did because I knew it wasn't going to go over well with them. But it was just an interesting time for me to see how what I had picked up on my own, wasn't picking up because I had picked it up pretty early on and going to meetings there that we're not going to start on time, and that's just the way they are. And I've always used that tactic in any situation. It doesn't, not even necessarily with Indigenous people. When I had irate parents come into my office, we would talk about all sorts of things, the skidoos or whatever, and slowly ease into, now let's talk about the reason you're here. After 15 minutes of just getting to know you, building a relationship, to me, it's a great strategy. And I always use it as a leader. Wasn't for my superintendent that day.
It sounds like the biggest gift you can give an Indigenous family or an Indigenous community is the gift of your time and your attention.
Yes. So that reminds me of a story working in a school and in a different role than Steve, but the school and the family were really struggling with connecting. So I was brought in to support and help build that connection back. And it was an Indigenous family, and we were just beginning to understand how we needed to do business differently to connect with Indigenous families at times. And it was difficult for the administration. They allowed things to progress in this way, slowly had a couple of meetings, allowed me to interact the way that I felt was right. And then I got the message that things weren't moving fast enough to get to the goal that we wanted to get to. Whereas I still needed to go, in my mind, the family still needed to talk more. They wanted me to come to their home. We'd sit at the table, which was fine for me to do. But then the pressure was, nope, we need to get this sorted out, and we've got a timeline, and it needs to happen. So now when the needs were no longer fitting with what the system saw as a need, then we were back to how we usually do business. And that kind of time that was needed and connection was cut off.
Some of the biggest gifts you can give as a white educator to Indigenous students and their families is the gift of your time and the gift of your attention. Make the time, take the time to ease into conversations with families before you get into the reason for the meeting. Want to find out more about restorative practices and restorative leadership? Check out our website at www.restorative.ca. Drop me an email to stan@restorative.ca if you'd like to find out more about the consulting work that we do. And let's take the time to listen to and attend to our Indigenous students and families.